Most people, when they read 1 Corinthians 9, they just assume Paul is angry. You read the text, and it really sounds like he is screaming at the top of his lungs. He's saying, am I not free? Am I not an apostle?
It feels like a man who is about to be fired, right? Desperately listing his credentials on his resume just to keep his job.
Yeah, exactly. But what if he isn't defensive at all? No. I mean, what if this isn't a plea for help? What if he's actually setting a massive trap?
Well, it changes the entire reading, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you read it as a defense, you see a guy fighting for his career. But if you read it as a trap, or what scholars call a pedagogical tool, you see a man fighting for the soul of his church.
And the difference between those two is basically the difference between a self-interested leader and a cruciform servant.
Right. It is a completely different paradigm.
And that is exactly where we are going today for this deep dive into 1 Corinthians chapter 9. It's a chapter that sits really awkwardly in the middle of a discussion about food, but somehow it ends up being about money and rights and freedom and
boxing.
And boxing, yes. So let's set the scene for you. If you've been following our Theology Brain chapter-by-chapter journey, we bring the best scholarship to the table. Today, we have 3 heavy-hitter commentaries open. We have David E. Garland,
Gordon D. Fee,
and Anthony C. Thiselton. And our mission is to decode this really complex chapter. So let's talk context first. Chapter 8 was all about meat sacrificed to idols.
Right, the food issue.
And then chapter 10 is about the history of Israel and warnings against idolatry. And right here in the middle, chapter 9, Paul starts talking about whether or not he gets a paycheck. Why the sudden detour?
Well, that has actually bothered scholars for centuries. In fact, many older scholars like Johannes Weiss, they literally thought this chapter was a mistake.
A typo.
Like a cut and paste error. They thought a scribe accidentally inserted a piece of a completely different letter right into the middle of this one. Or they thought it was an angry digression, that Paul just lost his temper and went on a random rant.
The angry tangent theory. I mean, I think we've all written emails like that late at night.
We definitely have. But modern scholarship has really moved away from that entirely. The consensus now, which Garland and Thiselton both heavily support, is that this isn't a digression at all, it is an illustration.
Okay, an illustration of what?
It's what rhetoricians call proof from example. Paul has just laid out a massive principle at the end of chapter 8 where he says, I will never eat meat again if it causes my brother to stumble.
Right, the principle of giving up a right for someone else.
Exactly. So now in chapter 9, he is proving that he actually lives by that rule.
So he's basically saying, you guys think giving up a steak dinner is hard. Let me show you what I've given up.
Precisely. And the stakes for this argument are incredibly high. The chapter moves from a defense of his rights in the first half to the absolute renunciation of those rights, and finally to this terrifying warning about self-discipline.
It's quite a journey. It goes from, I have every right to do this, all the way to, I would rather die than use that right.
It really is. So before we jump into the text, let's establish the commentary DNA. We need to know the theological lens of the scholars guiding us today, because that explains why they disagree on so many of these verses.
Let's start with David E. Garland. What is his specific vibe?
Garland is what I would call the literary architect. He is always looking at the flow of the argument and the rhetorical structure. His core stance is that Paul is absolutely not on the defensive here.
Okay, so he doesn't think Paul is angry.
Not at all. Garland thinks when Paul asks, am I not an apostle, he fully expects the Corinthians to shout yes. He believes Paul assumes his authority is completely intact, and he's just using that secure authority to teach a pedagogical lesson.
So Garland is, Team Paul is secure. Now what about Gordon D. Fee?
Fee is the historian and the reconstructionist. He is constantly reading between the lines to reconstruct the actual historical drama happening in the Corinthian church, and he argues that Paul is highly defensive.
So totally different read.
Completely. Fee thinks the rhetoric in this chapter is way too hot and too passionate to just be a calm example. He believes the Corinthians were actively questioning Paul's authority, specifically because he refused to take their money.
That's such an interesting twist, that refusing a salary actually made him look suspicious to them.
It is very counterintuitive to us today, but in that culture, money meant status. If you didn't take money, people thought you weren't worth anything. We'll get deep into that.
And finally, we have Anthony C. Thiselton.
Thiselton is the heavyweight synthesizer. He combines really deep sociological analysis, so looking at how patronage and social status worked in Rome with the long history of how the church has read this from the early church fathers up to Luther.
And where does he land on the defensive versus secure debate?
He offers a synthesis. He says it is an apologia, it is a defense. But the defense serves the paradigmatic function, meaning Paul has to fiercely defend the validity of his right so that his choice to renounce it actually has moral weight.
Oh, wow, that makes total sense. You can't sacrifice a right you don't actually have.
Exactly. You have to prove you own the car before you can impress anyone by choosing to walk to work instead.
That is a perfect analogy. All right, let's get our hands dirty in the text. Verses 1 through 3. This is the cold open. Paul writes, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord?"
And this right here is where the tone wars really begin between our commentators. Fee looks at those 4 rapid-fire rhetorical questions and says, this is an emotional outburst.
Because it feels punchy, right?
It is very punchy. Fee points to the Greek sentence structure and notes how rapid it is. He thinks Paul is directly responding to detractors who are whispering in the corners of the church saying he isn't a real apostle.
But Garland disagrees with that read.
Completely. Garland argues these are just shared premises that the audience already agrees with. He says, if the Corinthians didn't actually think Paul was an apostle, then the rest of the chapter's logic makes 0 sense.
Unpack that a bit. Why does the logic fail?
Well, Garland says the argument is basically, I am an apostle, therefore I have rights, but I don't use them. You guys are strong Christians, you have rights, so you shouldn't use them either. If the very first premise falls apart, if they don't think he's an apostle, the whole trap collapses.
Okay, I see that. There is a specific Greek word in verse 2 that I found really compelling in the commentaries. Sphragius. Paul calls the Corinthians the sphragius of his apostleship.
Yes, the seal. Thiselton does a great job pointing out that this is a legal and commercial term in the ancient world. It is a mark of ownership or a physical authentication, like a wax seal on a document or a certificate of authenticity.
So Paul is basically saying, you guys want to know if I'm a real apostle? Just look in the mirror.
Exactly. It is their very existence as a Christian community that proves his validity.
That is such a heavy pastoral guilt trip, though. Your existence is my credential.
It is heavy, but it is also profoundly theological. Think about what he is doing here. He is redefining what apostleship even means. It is not defined by letters of recommendation from headquarters in Jerusalem.
Or by how much money you make.
Right, or your social status markers. Apostleship is defined by the work in the Lord. If lives are changed and a church is planted, the spiritual authority is real regardless of the external packaging.
Let's move on to verses 4 through 7. Paul shifts from who I am to what I get. He starts listing out these apostolic rights. The right to food and drink, the right to a believing wife, and the right to not work.
And here we get some fascinating historical gossip, if we can call it that. When Paul mentions the right to take along a believing wife, the Greek phrase there is adelphin geneika, which literally translates to a sister wife or a Christian wife. He explicitly lists the other apostles, the Lord's brothers, and Cephas.
And Cephas is Peter.
Right, Peter. So Fee jumps all over this detail. He asks why I mention Peter specifically by name here. It heavily implies that Peter might have actually visited Corinth recently, and he probably brought his wife with him.
So the Corinthians are sitting there watching Peter, the rock of the church, show up with his wife. He's getting his travel expenses paid, acting like a high-status dignitary. And then they look over at Paul.
And Paul is single. Paul is working manual labor. Both Thiselton and Garland agree this text establishes a clear norm. It was completely normal for apostles to be financially supported and to travel with their families. Paul is the glaring outlier.
And that leads right into the right to not work. This is a concept that is so weird for modern ears because we have the Protestant work ethic. We respect a pastor who works hard secularly. But you hinted earlier that this wasn't the case in Corinth at all.
No, not even a little bit. Fee is very strong on this point. In the Greco-Roman culture, manual labor was culturally demeaning. It was what slaves did. It was what the uneducated lower classes did to survive.
So what was expected of a leader?
If you were a philosopher or a traveling teacher of wisdom, you were supposed to be supported by a wealthy patron. You were supposed to sit in the courtyard, think deep thoughts, and speak.
So when Paul is over in the marketplace stitching heavy leather tents together, getting his hands dirty and calloused.
It looked totally slavish. It made him look socially weak and irrelevant. By refusing their money and working with his hands, Paul wasn't just being humble in their eyes. He was engaging in a voluntary status demotion that deeply embarrassed the wealthy elites in the Corinthian church.
They wanted a polished celebrity pastor, and instead they got a blue-collar construction worker.
Exactly. And that is a huge cultural gap for us to cross. We see his tent-making as noble independence, but they saw it as a massive social embarrassment.
Yet Paul insists here, I absolutely have the right not to do this manual labor.
Yeah.
And he uses these three natural analogies to prove it. The soldier, the planter, and the shepherd.
Right, the argument from natural law. A soldier doesn't pay for his own weapons and rations. A guy who plants a vineyard gets to eat the grapes. A shepherd drinks the milk of the flock. It is universally understood in every culture that the worker benefits from the work.
But then in verse 8, things get a little weird hermeneutically. Paul quotes Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. And then he immediately asks this provocative question. Is it about oxen that God is concerned?
Yes. This is what we can call the ox crisis.
I love that phrase, the ox crisis.
Yeah.
Because honestly, it sounds like Paul is saying God absolutely does not care about animals. Does God care about oxen? No. He wrote this for us. Is Paul saying the Old Testament shouldn't be read literally?
This is a major battleground for our three commentators. Because on the surface, to a modern reader, it looks exactly like Paul is allegorizing, taking a historical text about a literal cow and just waving his hand and saying, this isn't about a cow, it's actually a secret code about paying preachers.
Which feels like interpretive cheating.
It does feel like cheating to us. But Thiselton steps in here to really bridge the cultural gap. He cites deep Jewish tradition and the philosopher Philo. Thiselton argues this is actually a classic, well-respected Jewish form of argument called calva homer, or a fortiori in Latin.
Okay, unpack that for us. What does that mean?
It means arguing from the lesser to the greater. The argument isn't God hates cows and only cares about people. The argument is, if God is so meticulously detailed that he actually wrote a law protecting the rights of a dumb beast of burden to eat while it works, how much more does he care about human beings, and specifically ministers of the gospel?
Oh, that makes way more sense. It is not a denial of the literal meaning. It is an expansion of the principle behind it.
Exactly. But Fee takes a slightly different angle here that we need to represent. Fee goes fully eschatological. He points to the phrase written for us. Fee says Paul truly believes the law was written specifically for the end times community, the church.
So Fee doesn't think it's just a clever debating trick.
No, Fee argues Paul believes the scriptures were fundamentally designed by the Spirit to guide the Christian community. It is a typological application. The ox is a type of the minister.
So the continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament here is that labor inherently deserves a misthos, a reward or a wage.
Right. Whether you are a literal ox, an ancient soldier, or an apostle planting a church, you get a misthos.
Which brings us to verses 11 and 12. Paul gets very personal with them. He says, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? And then he drops this cryptic line. If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Who are the others he is talking about?
That is the big historical mystery. He suggests these others are probably people like Apollos or Peter, or perhaps even the super apostles, those intruders who show up later in 2 Corinthians and try to take over the church.
But the key point, regardless of who they are, is that everyone else is taking the paycheck. Paul is the only guy refusing it.
Yes, and this is where Thiselton brings in some really heavy sociology that unlocks the whole chapter. He cites Peter Marshall's extensive work on a convent called Enmity in Corinth. This is all about the Roman system of patronage.
This is crucial to understand, right? Because in the ancient world, money was never just a neutral transaction.
Never. Money was friendship. It was a binding social obligation. If a wealthy person in the Corinthian church gave Paul a bag of coins, Paul instantly became their client. He owed them his loyalty. He owed them public honor.
So if he takes the check from the rich guy sitting in the front row, he suddenly can't criticize that same rich guy for, say, sleeping with his stepmother back in chapter 5.
Exactly, or suing his brother in chapter 6. The Sultan argues that by refusing their money, Paul was deliberately refusing the obligations of Roman friendship. He was refusing to be bought and owned, and that deeply offended the wealthy patrons.
It's like refusing a lavish gift at a mafia wedding. You just don't do it because it sends a very specific message.
The message is, I am not in your pocket. I don't owe you anything.
And Paul uses a fascinating military term right around here, stegomen.
Yes. We put up with, or we endure, all things. It is the same root word he uses later in chapter 13 when he says, love bears all things. Thiselton connects stegomen to a military metaphor. Paul is willing to suffer physical deprivation and endure manual labor so that he doesn't create an ekopa.
An ekope, what is that?
It literally means a cut in the road or a massive hindrance. Paul won't take their money because he refuses to put a pothole in the road of the gospel.
So his financial independence is actually his missional strategy. If he takes their money, the gospel is hindered because it makes him look like just another traveling philosopher doing it for the cash.
And it might hinder the poorer members of the church who can't afford to support him. They might think the gospel is only for the wealthy who can buy access to the teacher. Or it hinders the absolute truth because, as we said, he can no longer speak freely without fear of losing his funding.
Moving to verses 13 and 14, Paul brings in the temple argument next. He notes that priests who work in the temple get to eat the meat from the altar. And then he just drops the ultimate hammer. He says the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel.
This is a huge moment textually. Fee highlights that this is one of the very few times in all of Paul's letters that he explicitly cites a teaching of the historical Jesus to settle a structural church dispute.
He is referring to Luke 10, verse 7, or Matthew 10, verse 10, right?
Yeah.
Where Jesus tells the disciples the worker is worthy of his wages.
Exactly. So look at what Paul has done. He has the law of nature with the soldier. He has the law of Moses with the ox. He has the universal practice of the temple priests. And now he has the direct spoken command of Jesus Christ himself.
He has built an absolutely unassailable fortress of proof that he should be getting paid.
And that is what makes David E. Garland's reading so powerful here. Garland emphasizes that Paul cites the highest authority in the universe, Jesus, only to deliberately disobey the right that Jesus confers.
That is the massive twist of the chapter. He spends 14 entire verses building this theological skyscraper of rights just to personally blow it up.
Yes, because for Paul, there is a principle that is somehow even higher than a direct command of Jesus regarding wages. And that higher principle is the missional love of Jesus regarding lost souls. He has the God-given right to demand pay, but he has the internal compulsion to love them for free.
That leads us right into verses 15 through 18. This is really the emotional core of the text. He says, but I have not used any of these rights. And then he says, I would rather die than Aya. And the sentence just kind of breaks off. It fractures.
It does. Thiselton identifies this grammatical break as an aposiopesis.
An aposiopesis.
Right. It's a rhetorical device where a speaker is so completely overcome with raw emotion that they physically can't even finish the sentence structure. I would rather die than let anyone deprive me of this boast.
But what exactly is the boast? This is what's confusing for a lot of readers. Is he boasting out of arrogance? Like, I'm better than you guys because I work for free.
No, it is not arrogance. This is the paradox of reward that Fee explains so beautifully. In verse 16, Paul says he is compelled to preach. He uses the Greek word anako, which means sheer necessity.
Like he has no choice in the matter.
Right. He's comparing himself to a slave or maybe a Jeremiah-style Old Testament prophet.
Yeah.
He can't not preach. The fire is in his bones. So because he is forced to preach by God, he gets no special credit for doing it.
So if my boss forces me to do a task, I don't get a gold star for doing the bare minimum of my job description.
Exactly. So the question becomes, where is Paul's reward? Where is his actual freedom if he's just a slave to the mission?
Right. Where's the boast?
His freedom is found in doing the one single thing he doesn't have to do. God forces him to preach, but God doesn't force him to do it for free. He has the right to charge. So by freely choosing to preach without taking a salary, he turns a divine necessity into a free will offering of love.
That is theological gymnastics of the absolute highest order.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Garland puts it this way. Paul flatly refuses to be a peddler of the word. His boast is that the gospel remains totally free of charge. By offering it for free in a culture where every philosopher charged heavy tuition, he authenticates the very nature of grace.
Because grace is completely free, well, the messenger must be completely free.
Precisely. If he charged money for a message about free grace, he would be structurally obscuring the very theology he's trying to teach them.
Now we get to the really famous section. Verses 19 through 23, the chameleon strategy. This is where he says to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. To the weak, I became weak.
Yes, and this is easily one of the most quoted and honestly most misused passages in the entire Bible.
Right. People use it to justify anything. Like, I became a heavy drinker to win the heavy drinkers.
Which is definitely not what Paul is saying or doing. Let's look at the structure here. It is fascinating. He lists 4 distinct groups. He lists Jews, those under the law, those without the law, meaning Gentiles, and finally, the weak.
Let's break down that last group, The weak. Because back in chapter 8, the weak were specifically the people with highly sensitive religious consciences who couldn't handle eating idol meat. But here, Thiselton argues it's a much broader category.
Right. Thiselton and Fee actually have a bit of a showdown on this exact point. Fee looks at the text and notes a missing parallel. Paul says to the weak, I became weak, but he purposefully never says to the strong, I became strong.
That is a great observation. The trajectory is exclusively downward.
Always downward, always servile. And Thiselton adds a deep sociological layer to this. He says the weak aren't just people struggling with theological scruples. In Roman society, the weak are the socially vulnerable, the people without any status or power.
So it's the exact people that Paul's manual labor identified him with.
Exactly. So when Paul says he becomes weak, he isn't just pretending to have a sensitive conscience to make someone feel better. He is materially accepting a lower social status. Garland really emphasizes this low status aspect. Becoming weak was a massive social demotion.
He abandons his high status as an educated Pharisee to win the statusless people of Corinth.
It's profound solidarity. Thiselton cites Clarence Glad's work on ancient Epicurean adaptability. Glad talks about this concept where a good philosophical teacher dynamically adapts to the specific needs of the student. But Paul takes that well beyond just changing his teaching style. He doesn't just adapt his words, he adapts his very existence.
And the ultimate goal of all this adapting, he uses a commercial term here, kerdin, to win or to gain.
It literally means to make a profit. It's missionary accounting language. Think of the ledger. He loses his rights, he loses his social status, he loses his money. But he gains people. The human soul saved is the only profit he cares about.
But there has to be a boundary, right? Because otherwise he's just a shapeshifter with no core convictions. In verse 21, he says, he is not without the law of God, but he is under the law of Christ.
Yes, that caveat in verse 21 is crucial. So we don't think Paul is just an inconsistent hypocrite. He isn't lawless when he hangs out with the Gentiles. He is in-lawed to Christ.
And what does that mean practically?
The law of Christ isn't a new legalistic list of rules like don't smoke and don't drink. It's the theological pattern of the cross. It's the law of self-giving, sacrificial love. So he will adapt his cultural method endlessly, but he will never compromise his moral allegiance to Christ.
So he's completely flexible on cultural preferences, but totally rigid on gospel truth.
That's a very clean way to put it.
Finally, we hit the gym. Verses 24 through 27, the athletic metaphor. Paul writes, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize?
We need a quick context check here. The Isthmian Games were held right near Corinth every 2 years. They were second only to the Olympics. The Corinthians absolutely loved their sports. So this specific metaphor would have landed viscerally for them.
And he talks about running and boxing. He says, I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. And then he delivers the punchline literally in verse 27. I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave.
The Greek word there is amazing. Hypopiazu. It literally means to strike under the eye, to give a black eye, to beat someone black and blue.
Ouch. So is Paul talking about literal physical self-flagellation here? Like, is he whipping himself in a monastery?
Thiselton strongly argues no. It is not literal physical asceticism. It's a metaphor for incredibly strict personal discipline. When Paul talks about his body, he often means his whole life in the public domain.
So he treats his public life roughly.
Right. He treats himself roughly. He doesn't pamper his ego. He doesn't insist on his comforts. He forcibly makes his physical life and his desires serve the mission.
And what is the fear driving this? Why is he giving himself a metaphorical black eye? He says, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. The Greek word is adokimos.
And this is where Gordon Fee gets incredibly serious in his commentary. Fee says, this is not a hypothetical warning, this is real fear. Paul, the great apostle, the guy who literally saw the risen Lord on the Damascus road, is terrified that he could somehow miss the prize.
Wait, so is Paul actually saying he thinks he could lose his salvation?
That is the massive theological hot potato of this chapter. Garland suggests the prize here is the imperishable crown, meaning final salvation and glory, which he contrasts with the rotting celery or pine wreaths they gave out at the Isthmian Games.
And what does Fee say?
Fee argues that Paul always keeps assurance and warning in a tight tension. He's not saying he wakes up terrified of hell every single day, but he is saying that mere entry into the Christian race does not automatically guarantee you will finish it if you abandon the way of Christ.
That is a deeply sobering thought. Just because you have a jersey and you're on the team doesn't mean you're getting the medal.
Exactly. And remember, the wider context is idolatry. He is setting up his argument for chapter 10. He is essentially saying, I radically discipline myself to give up my valid rights because if I get lazy and if I get arrogant and start indulging in my rights to eat whatever I want, I will walk right back into the idol temple and I could fall away entirely.
So a lack of self-control, specifically regarding how we handle our personal rights and freedoms, is actually a salvation issue for Paul.
It certainly seems to be. If your demand for personal freedom leads you away from the law of Christ, which is sacrificial love, then you are actively running off the track. You are dekamos. You are disqualified.
Wow. Let's do the commentary showdown. We've had Garland, Fee, and Thiselton in the ring together as we look at how they handled the chapter, who wins which round.
Okay, for the tone wars, I have to give the trophy to Gordon Fee. He really captures the deep emotional texture of the passage. When you read Fee's commentary, you actually feel Paul's personal hurt. You understand that this isn't just a dry academic lecture, it's a pastor whose spiritual children are rejecting him. That defensive tone explains the torrent of rapid-fire questions better than anything else.
But for the structural argument,
Garland takes the structural prize, hands down. His argument that the defense is actually a sophisticated rhetorical trap is brilliant. He shows exactly how Paul gets the Corinthians to nod along saying, yes, you have rights, yes, you are an apostle, only to snap the trap shut and say, great, now give them all up just like I did.
And what about Thiselton?
Thiselton absolutely wins the context trophy. His work on the ox crisis using Jewish hermeneutics and his sociological unpacking of the weak is just unmatched.
Because he bridges the gap between the ancient world of Roman patronage and the modern reader.
He does it better than anyone. He shows us that the weak aren't just annoying people with overly tender consciences. They are the socially powerless. And identifying with them costs you your social standing.
So bringing all of these threads together, what is the single big idea, the controlling theological concept of 1 Corinthians chapter 9?
I think if we synthesize all three scholars, we land somewhere like this. True apostolic freedom is the voluntary enslavement of oneself to the needs of others for the sake of the gospel's advance.
The voluntary enslavement. That is a phrase that really sticks with you.
Because it is the ultimate paradox of the cross. We prove we are truly free, not by what we forcefully take, but by what we willingly give up.
So how did this actually land for us today? Let's build the application bridge.
I think it hits us hardest right in our modern rights culture. We are completely obsessed with our rights today. We say, I have a right to say whatever I want on social media. I have a right to spend my money how I want. I have a political right to this or a social right to that.
And Paul challenges that core assumption. He says, simply having a valid right doesn't mean you must or even should use it.
In fact, he argues that real spiritual maturity might actually mean having the right and consciously choosing to bury it. If your political post or your lifestyle choice or your spending habit deeply hinders a neighbor or confuses a weak observer, Paul says kill it, strike a blow to it, beat it black and blue.
That connects directly to the strong faction in Corinth. Just because you technically can do something doesn't mean you should.
Right. There is also a huge application here for money and ministry. Paul carefully balances the legitimate right to pastoral wages with the deep suspicion of pastoral greed. He says pastors absolutely should be paid. It is a direct command of Jesus.
But he also models this extreme financial transparency.
Yes. A willingness to sacrifice the pay if it gets in the way of the message. It's a huge challenge to modern ministry models. Are we dependent on wealthy patrons and big donors who implicitly own us? Or are we completely free to speak the hard truth?
And finally, missional adaptability. The whole idea of being all things to all people. We live in a heavily polarized world right now. We tend to isolate in echo chambers with people who look and think exactly like us. But Paul intentionally shattered those barriers.
He went to the Jews, he went to the Gentiles, he went to the socially weak. He entered their worlds.
But he did it without ever losing the law of Christ.
That is the key application. We must adapt in our cultural preferences, but never in our morality. We change the method to reach people, but we never compromise the message of the cross.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I am honestly just stuck on that final violent image of the runner giving himself a black eye.
It really is the defining image of the entire chapter, the disciplined athlete.
So here's the provocative question for you, the listener, to mull over this week. If Paul, the great apostle, who literally saw the risen Lord, was terrified of being disqualified because of a lack of self-discipline, what makes you think your personal rights are safe to fiercely hold on to?
That is the haunting question. Paul has just told us he runs his race with fear and trembling, And next time in Chapter 10, he's going to open up the Old Testament history books to show us exactly what happens to GEMT people when they think they are completely safe just because they're in the race.
The wilderness generation is coming. You definitely don't want to miss that. We'll see you in the next deep dive.